Hello and welcome to Politics Today. Maybe we should rename this programme Brexit Today, because this is the issue that is dominating everything in British politics and has done since 2016. So with all the uncertainty going on, I'm afraid we're going to have to discuss Brexit, but also from a spiritual point of view and also from a military point of view. So in this programme today, I'll be joined by Hugh Kitson, who's a documentary film producer, as well as Peter Mcilvenna, who is now the campaigns director for UKIP. So welcome to the programme. I'll start off with you, if I can, Peter. Congratulations being on the campaigns director. So in any future election campaigns, you'll be the one in the driving seat.
Yes.
And driving UKIP's policy and campaign direction. So congratulations on that position. It's well deserved. Can you give us an update? As of the recording of this programme, we know that we recorded this programme a week before it's aired, and the way that politics is going at the moment, anything can happen. So where are we now, as in terms of this recording, where our Prime Minister Theresa May is trying to negotiate with Jeremy Corbyn, a potential Marxist government in waiting, in order to get her Brexit withdrawal through Parliament and into law?
Well, as you said, anything can happen, and I think we've seen anything is happening. So at the moment, we're recording this programme on Monday the 8th, and today a bill will go through the House of Lords for the third vote, which is the Yvette Cooper amendment, which would force the Prime Minister to put down a date where we will leave. At the moment, it's quite fluid. She's talked about leaving on the 12th of April, also talking about leaving in June, also in May. There are all different dates being put around. So today in the House of Lords, they will vote through that amendment. If they do vote through it, which I expect they will do, then the bill could actually become law on that day, today, or could become law on the Tuesday. Theresa May then is going to Brussels to talk to Macron, the French leader, and Merkel, the German leader, who I think in their hands is our future, it seems. So she's going to talk to them. On Wednesday, we have an EU summit, and Brexit will be the main topic. And then from that, they will decide what will happen. So possibly we will leave on Friday, the 12th. I don't think that will happen, because if we did leave and there isn't an agreement, then it would be on a no deal. And our MPs do not want us to leave on WTO terms on a no deal. So what probably will happen is there will be a short extension or a long extension, or something in between. Who knows? They've talked about a few months extension. They've talked about a 1 year, a 2 year, a 4 year. Obviously, the big issue is the 22nd of May or the European elections.
Absolutely.
And if we pass the 22nd of May still in the EU, we have to take part in those European elections. And the cut-off date is Friday the 12th. So Friday the 12th of April, the British government have to tell the EU whether they will participate or not participate. And so that's the deadline. The danger, obviously, is if we do participate, then that will have possibly disastrous consequences for the Conservative Party in that. So that's where we are at the moment. This is the week that we're facing. So within a week, we should know whether we're participating in EU elections and how long that extension has been, probably a 1 to 2 year extension or longer.
And before we talk about the main topic I'm going to discuss with you, Hugh, isn't this dangerous for democracy and the way that Theresa May is doing everything she can to get her a very, very unpopular Brexit agreement through the House of Commons into law, which is the only agreement the EU are giving us? What are your concerns about the state of our democracy and the state of our parliament with all this chaos regarding Brexit? Because we should have left by now.
We should have left by now. I think it's very dangerous for democracy, because there was a clear majority back in 2016 for us to get out of the EU. And really, you can't be half in and half out. And all the political shenanigans that have gone on since then is to keep us tied to the European Union. So we don't really have sovereignty. And unfortunately, Theresa May's deal, which she struck and nobody wants, keeps us, as Boris Johnson put it, as a vassal state. We're still being run by the EU without having any say on the rules that we're having to keep to. So I do believe it's a betrayal of democracy.
And Peter, I mean, I've read recently from what the emails sent out by David Hathaway in particular that those who want to keep Britain in the European Union, the Remainers who don't believe in democracy unless it actually gives them the result that they want. That's my first point. The second point is that they were saying that this is to do with the full implementation of the Lisbon Treaty in 2020. So therefore, if we stay in the European Union until 2020, then we'll be locked in for the EU forever. Is this what some of our MPs are working towards?
Well, the problem is with the treaties, I've heard different things, the Lisbon Treaty in 2020. I've heard other things, for instance, we would be forced to adopt the euro. There are a number of issues and concerns about it. The problem is, obviously, the treaties are often so complicated that no one can really understand it. Only is when you go to take a court action and you actually test the case, you find out what it actually means. So it's very confusing and the danger is obviously the longer we're in the EU, the more tied in we become, the more of the argument that the British people deserve a right to think again. They didn't get it. They didn't understand. We need to put it back to them. They didn't realise it would be so complicated. Of course it's complicated because we could have left immediately. We could have said, well, let's have a talk for a month. If we don't come to continue the status quo in terms of trade, because we want a trade agreement, not any agreement past that. So if we don't have a trade agreement, then we just walk away, and that could be done in a month. So all this continuing negotiations are to take us further down the road to make it look so difficult that in the end of the day, as most people probably watching this programme and think, I am just sick and tired of hearing about Brexit. I just want to go away and I want something to happen. And that's, I think, what Theresa May was hoping with the MPs whenever she put down her withdrawal bill for the third time, that withdrawal agreement. She was hoping they would just say, look, we'll just take it. We're sick and tired talking about this. We'll agree to anything. We will sign on the dotted line wherever you want us to sign, whatever you want us to sign. And I think we are coming to the point of view which is quite concerning, that the political system has just pushed people down and down and down. They will take whatever they're offered.
Which is dangerous.
Yeah.
And Hugh, you come at this from a different angle. Can you share with us, because you recently wrote an article for Heart newspaper.
Yes.
You mentioned Manley Phillips, who does a great job there.
Yes, this is
talking about the spiritual imperative of why this nation has to leave the European Union with a no deal. Spiritually, can you tell us why, for our nation's long-term survival and future, why it's necessary that we have to come out of the EU with a no deal?
Yes. Well, the article itself is in a Christian paper called Heart. It's quite a complex issue, and it goes back to part of our calling as a nation. And we actually went into this in a film I made more than a decade ago now called The Destiny of Britain. And part of our calling as a nation, apart from taking the gospel to the ends of the earth, was to be the sourest nation that would facilitate the restoration of the nation of Israel. And that's where the Balfour Declaration comes in. That was part of our calling as a nation. Okay, we betrayed the Balfour Declaration as we went through the mandate. Right at the very outset of the State of Israel, 1948, the Arabs have tried repeatedly to destroy the nation of Israel. That was certainly the case in the Six-Day War, which the Israelis won. I believe it was the hand of God. They won it spectacularly. Then 6 years later, in 1974, again, Egypt and Syria.
73, sorry.
73, yeah. Yes. October 73, they tried to once again destroy the nation of Israel. And they came within a whisker of doing it, actually. And after a few weeks, Israel basically was in a position where they could have taken both Damascus and Cairo. And a peace armistice, ceasefire, was imposed. And the Arab nations at that point decided they were going to do things differently. They were going to use the other nations to put pressure on Israel And so we had effectively an oil embargo. Oil was used as a weapon. And the French were quite willing to go down this route in helping the Arabs with their agenda. Other nations like Britain were sort of forced into it. But at that time, you had the European Economic Commission, which later became the EU, and their first foreign policy came out of this. A Euro-Arab dialogue was instituted in 1973 and continued for many years into the early 1980s. And they decided that the European nations, if they were going to have favourable trading conditions with the Arab nations, including oil, would adopt their agenda. And basically, I've flushed out 6 main points. First of all was to ensure a positive coverage of Arabs and Muslims, as well as their causes in the Western media. And we've seen the media actually be really quite anti-Israel in many respects. The next one was that the European nations were to recognize Arab sovereignty over East Jerusalem. Thirdly, Israel was to withdraw to what are called pre-1967 borders, which are basically indefensible anyway. The European governments would be required to force Israel to accept the rights of a Palestinian Arab state to exist, no matter what, in the entire West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Fifthly, the European governments were obliged to recognize the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Back then, in the 1970s, the PLO was doing a good many terrorist incidents. They're blowing up planes, assassinating leaders even on European soil. And sixthly, we were to favour Arab-Muslim immigration into European countries and for the immigrants to have the same rights as citizens. Now, if we stayed tied to the European Union, we have to go along with that. So never mind the peace process as such, there has to be a Palestinian state no matter what. Now, as far as our calling is concerned, that is disastrous. We cannot, if you like, re-enter the calling that we had and sadly betrayed if we continue to be tied to the European Union. So we need to cut both our political ties and spiritual ties with the European Union if we're truly to stand with Israel.
And Peter, what concerns me very much is the direction of the EU foreign policy, particularly when it comes to Israel. And we know from what God says in Genesis chapter 12 that those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And the fact that constantly European foreign policy just singles out Israel all the time, instead of dealing with the Iranian nuclear threat or dealing with the rise of ISIS in the Middle East or the problems of the Islamic Brotherhood or failed Middle Eastern states, their biggest concern is about the expansion of Jewish homes in Israel's eternal capital, Jerusalem. Surely this is enough to be an indicator that Europe is going in the wrong direction.
No, absolutely. And when you look at the EU, it's in long-term decline. And it has been long-term decline since it was set up. And you look at the bloc of the EU compared to the bloc of the United States, and you've got a similar amount of people. You should have similar clout on the world stage. And yet the EU is just not regarded in the same level of importance as the United States is. So I think looking at this, certainly from a spiritual point of view, I absolutely agree that part of the decline of the EU can be traced to how they have treated Israel, the policies they have put in place. When you could look at the United States and the United States has been blessed in many ways. I think a lot of that is because they have been often the only country to stand with Israel and support them through many difficult situations. And it has been America supplying a lot of the military aid that God has used to protect Israel. So absolutely, I believe it is that God is blessing those nations who are blessing Israel, and that is the United States, and Europe is left on the side.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting what you mentioned earlier, Hugh, about the European-Arab dialogue, which is a famous book has been written by Bat-Yor. I had the pleasure of interviewing her about 5 years ago on the Middle East Report, explaining the whole concept behind the Europe-Arab dialogue. Now, if this agreement is the de facto foreign affairs agreement of the European Union, and their desire then to foster Arab-Muslim relations at the expense of Europe's more traditional allies, such as Israel or those nations as the United States or other Western nations, isn't this the danger of being the kind of secret agenda within the European Union?
Yes, I think so very much. It's very interesting. Theresa May was at an Arab summit at the end of February. I think she was going to see Donald Tusk and the Europeans about Brexit rather than endorsing that their dialogue necessarily. But we have to come out of it. There's one of the phrases that came out of that summit was that they endorse their previous Euro-Arab dialogue agreements, and they went on to say that the settlements and the Jewish presence in either the West Bank or what's called East Jerusalem is a violation of international law, which of course you've had from the United Nations. It's actually no such thing. I'm doing a documentary at the moment on the legitimacy of Israel in international law, in all of Eretz Israel. International policy, and yes, it's policy, it expresses the will of the European nations, is not international law. And this is one of the deceptions. In fact, the whole European saga, if you like, has been one of deception. When we went into the EEC, it was not publicly said that we would eventually become part of the United States of Europe. And yet this political agenda on the European side was there. We just weren't told about it. And so our participation in the whole European Union exercise, as far as we're concerned, has been a massive deception. And so spiritually, how can that be right?
Absolutely, which is a really good question. And I have to ask you, Peter, many, and I've had a few emails coming in from some other viewers saying, why are you discussing Brexit? Why are you discussing politics? Because this is not a salvation message, it's not a gospel message. But essentially it is a gospel message because it's about freedom. And if we are not in our own nation to determine our own laws that govern us, then we have to be under that on which we are of the European Union. And we know that we're increasingly seeing a lot of very hostile anti-Israel legislation, anti-Christian legislation in terms of EU directives that are making life very, very difficult for Christians throughout the European Union. Isn't this an indicator to say why Brexit is so important? Because this is ultimately about our freedom and our sovereignty.
Well, absolutely, I think it is absolutely about freedom. But even if this is not a central issue, I think it's vital that Christians are aware of what's happening so we can pray. And to come at this and to explain this from a Christian viewpoint and asking the viewers to pray, I think is vital and is a way that we will break the deadlock and see change happen in society. So whatever issue it is, I think the role here of Revelation TV is to highlight those issues to the public, to the praying public, and encourage them to pray, take to their churches and get involved. But on this, it's certainly, I think it's a freedom of speech. Many freedoms in Europe are slowly being taken away. And then you also have the huge clash, which you has touched on, of Islam coming into the EU, and then the problem is if you do not know what you believe, then you'll just give into anything, that Islam can take that vacuum. And to me, one of the exciting things happening in the EU, and it may be the way that God brings the EU down, is the rise of populist parties across the EU. And I think a poll had last week that if the EU elections were held, then it would be between 150 and 250 populist parties making enough groups out of 660, I think, MEPs. So there would be a huge block within that. And many of those parties have wanted to re-understand what it means to be Christian and re-understand the foundations. They may not all be Christians leading those parties, but they realise the Christian foundations of each of their nations, and they want to have that as prior importance. So I think that could be one of the most exciting things to happen, and it may be that Britain are part of that if we do participate in EU elections, and that we can be part of these huge groups. And it goes against what the EU have done over the decades, which is to abandon any of our Christian history, to be anti-Israel in any way possible. And I think this could be actually the thing which holds that back and begins to push us back. Obviously, we serve God and we leave it up to him. The end result is to him. But that could be somewhere, and I think it's important for us to pray into that and pray that if that is what God is willing, then that will happen quickly.
Absolutely. And Hugh, there's no doubt about it that the whole issue to do with Brexit is probably the biggest spiritual, political battle that we've really seen since the start of the Second World War, and the chaos and the mess that we're in there. I can only see that historically this is the only very similar present time. The only difference is we don't have Nazi forces invading France and being very close to our borders, and we face a direct invasion. But politically, they're very, very similar in terms of the political chaos involved and the battle and the struggle to push this through. How should we as Christians pray and intercede regarding the mess that we see in Parliament and in Westminster?
Well, I think it's what we're seeing is conquest by stealth, actually. It's not so different from Dunkirk, for instance. But I think we also need to come in repentance before God. Absolutely. Because we, in one sense, we deserve to come down as a nation. And so I think we can only appeal to the Lord for deliverance, because only he can deliver us. The shenanigans going on at the moment are just unbelievable. And there is no doubt that the enemy of our souls, if I can put it that way, Satan, is trying to keep us entangled in this European project, which, as I said earlier, has taken us through deception, really. And so we can only appeal to the Lord to deliver us miraculously. I believe if we come out, and I do believe he's going to deliver us, if it hasn't already happened on April the 12th, and of course this is going to air after April the 12th, we can only cry out to God for deliverance, I believe.
Absolutely. And Peter, do you think we need to harness in on this whole issue to do with kind of deception? Because, you know, Jesus said in Matthew 25, one of the hallmarks of the last days is deception. And if it were not possible, even the elect would be deceived. So we're living in a time of incredible deception. The fact is that our governments, our MPs, are not giving us all the facts. They're not telling us that Europe is heading in for a European superstate, and the next stage is a European army, and pressure for Switzerland to no longer to remain neutral, but to join the European Union, or being forced to join, indicates that this European project is accelerating at pace towards a European superstate. Why are we not being told the truth about this?
When you go, you've also been over to Brussels or Strasbourg many times, and you see the chaos of what is happening. And it seems to be set up so that MEPs aren't always aware of what's happening. In fact, a week ago they had a vote on copyright directives. And in that, you had 13 MEPs said, no, we didn't want to vote that. We want to vote a different way. We need to stop it. And they couldn't. They had to go ahead with it. But it showed that the chaos, and I remember going there over with a UKIP delegation about 10, 11 years ago, and they would be printing off all the sheets, and they would be quickly going through it, trying to understand how they were to vote. And it was utter chaos. They had half an hour to go through a Rema paper this size and understand how they were going to vote. And it seems to be the whole thing is set up just to cause confusion, and even the MEPs are not really central to what's happening. It all happens behind closed doors, and people are not aware. So the whole thing, I think, has been set up politically, certainly, to not be transparent as we are used to it. But you also, then you look here, you have the chaos, because you have two political systems we put in place. One is you've got a parliamentary system, one you've got a referendum, and then you've got two wills of the people which seem to be different. So you've got utter chaos there. But at least in the UK, and this is why I've always said it's vital that we leave the EU, is that you can sit and you can watch, turn on BBC Parliament channel, you can see what's happening, you can see the list of votes, you can lobby your MP at any time, you can elect them in, you can elect them out. And it is much more transparent than many other countries, and certainly than the EU. So that's why I would want to return, because at least if the power is returned to the UK, we as the electorate, we as the voters, we as Christians, we can input and engage properly, and we can make the proper decisions. And at the moment with the EU, it's such a gap that we don't have any power over what happens.
Yeah. And 30 seconds, I'll let you sum up the programme. How important is it that we wake up to the spiritual deception taking place, particularly regarding the whole debate over Brexit?
Vital, because it's going to affect our lives. And it's going to affect the next generation. And secular humanism will basically stamp out the gospel if we continue with this European project.
Hugh and also Peter, thank you so much for being my guests on Politics Today. And I don't apologise for doing a programme again about Brexit, because the whole issue is about our freedom and it's about our sovereignty. And that's why we got to continue to pray that God's will would be done for our nation, that our nation will be again an independent, sovereign nation, and not being controlled by Brussels and those unelected bureaucrats. So I want to thank you for watching Politics Today.